Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm LELDF President Jason Johnson, joined by my co-host and LELDF Director of Policy, Sean Kennedy. This week, we got a great interview for you with Doug O'Connell. Doug is a criminal defense lawyer in the Travis County, Texas area. He's a retired colonel from the Army, former JAG lawyer, and now his practice is largely focused around protecting the rights of men and women in the military and the rights of law enforcement officers. So he's become sort of the go-to criminal defense lawyer for City of Austin police officers, Travis County sheriff's deputies, even Texas Highway Patrol, all of the agencies in there that have been victimized by the district attorney in Travis County, Jose Garza. Jose Garza is a Soros-funded prosecutor, one we call a progressive prosecutor, who spends a lot of his energy not prosecuting criminals, but prosecuting cops.
And the reason, Jason, is simple. He's taking a page out of the playbook of George Soros, his benefactor. I mean, the reason he got more than $500,000 from George Soros was to do that work. And we know, and I know this interview, we talk to Doug about something called the Wren Collective, which basically enforces Soros's agenda in these offices. They actually wrote Jose Garza's policy manual, and we proved that in one of our reports. So the fact that he's doing this isn't surprising. It's still outrageous. But what Doug reveals in this interview is truly shocking, and he's doing yeoman's work fighting back on the ground there.
So it's a good inside look at what is going on where the rubber meets the road with Soros prosecutors going after cops. We are joined by attorney Doug O'Connell of O'Connell West in Austin, Texas. Doug's background is unique and impressive. If I asked him to introduce himself, he probably would say it in like one sentence, but I'm going to do a little bit more than that. So, uh, first of all, Doug is retired from the U.S. Army at the rank of colonel. So thanks for your service to our country, Doug, first and foremost. Um, he's a graduate of the Wake Forest School of Law. He also has a couple of master's degree from the U.S. Army War College and from the Naval Postgraduate School. Doug is obviously an attorney with vast experience, primarily criminal defense, and I think your practice is really focused mostly on dealing with military rights, dealing with individuals serving in the military, make sure they're receiving all their rights, and then criminal defense of law enforcement officers, which of course is the reason we asked you to join us today, is your work in that area, which I think takes up a lot of your practice. You have not lots of experience defending law enforcement officers, and I think um, you know, probably wish you had less experience doing it because there would be less police, law enforcement officers actually being charged and needing a criminal defense lawyer. So I think it's fair to say that you are, the preeminent criminal defense lawyer for law enforcement officers in the greater Travis County and beyond Texas area. And so thank you for all that, and thanks for joining us today, Doug.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
The main reason I wanted to have you on is, you and I interact pretty regularly. You have represented a couple law enforcement officers that the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund has been involved in some capacity. So you represented deputies James Johnson and Zach Camden. You represented them and you did a stellar job. They were acquitted at trial. You've also represented Chance Bretches over a number of years and others. You represented Chris Taylor, who was an Austin police officer who had been charged and actually was convicted by a jury, but you had that conviction overturned in your intermediate appellate court there in Texas. So, and that's recently. So that's just a few of the cases. And I know that you've represented law enforcement for a long time. So, but that's a few, and that's kind of your focus. And that's really why we wanted to have you on today. So I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about your district attorney's office in Travis County, led by Jose Garza.
Yeah, so let me start with saying something nice about him. I guess I should say I'm pretty down on all politicians these days, right? Jose Garza ran on a platform of prosecuting cops, targeting and prosecuting law enforcement officers. And unlike a lot of politicians, he meant what he said and has been executing that agenda. And so let me give him credit. He was honest about that, and he has upheld his campaign pledge. He has been aggressive in targeting cops and prosecuting them at every turn. And unfortunately, it's kept me and my team very busy over the last 6 years. And we're not done. You mentioned Chance Bretches. We'll go to trial on Chance's case, as you know, in June.
He's gone after Chance Bretches relentlessly. So Chance actually has 2 cases pending. So he's brought that, but he's charged, I think the number's 27 law enforcement officers that have been charged by José Garza since he took office. We're involved in cases across the country that involve, anti-police prosecutors, but I think José Garza is probably the most prolific of them in terms of just going out and charging cops. And I'm happy to say, though, of those 27, Doug, I mean, how many have been convicted?
0.
Yeah, 0. So,
Yeah.
it's like, the proof is in the pudding. As you pointed out, like, he goes around charging cops. He's doing that's what he said he would do, and he's doing it. So, yes, but he's not doing it effectively. So that tells us what? I mean, in your experience as a criminal justice or criminal defense lawyer, if a prosecutor charges a lot of people and none of them get convicted, what does that tell you?
Yeah, he is trying to manufacture cases that really aren't supported by the facts. You and I know that every law enforcement use of force is ugly. It never looks good, especially to civilian jurors. When officers have to use force, it never looks pretty, and there's always something that could be done better next time. But that doesn't mean that their actions rise to the level of criminal behavior.
No question about it, and actually just in getting ready to talk to you today, I was reviewing a few articles from the Austin News about, quotes from Mr. Garza about these cases, and over again, it seems that his standard is he says the Austin community or the Travis County community needs to basically decide which of these cases they wanna find officers guilty. So that's why he basically his philosophy is, "Let's put them all in front of a jury." And is that really the way a prosecutor is supposed to approach their job? I mean, isn't the reason we have prosecutors? Because otherwise you could just say, "Okay, anytime something that looks bad on video happens, let's just have a jury decide."
Yeah, we elect prosecutors in order for them to exercise prosecutorial discretion. And so we're investing that authority in an elected official to make decisions on which cases should be prosecuted and which shouldn't, which cases should be presented to a grand jury and which cases aren't necessarily required to do so.
Glad you brought that grand jury aspect up because one of the cases been in the news recently, there was a situation in Austin where a terrorist started shooting people up at a bar in Austin. And some Austin police officers responded very quickly, got to the scene, and as they say in law enforcement, neutralized the threat. This man had already killed 3 people and could have killed countless others and injured many, many others. But the Austin police officers arrived and they did their job just exactly the way they're supposed to do, like they normally do. But the immediate response of the district attorney's office was basically, we're gonna we're gonna let a grand jury decide if these cops did anything wrong. Can you speak to that a little bit about that approach and what's wrong with that?
I think it's important to note that a whole bunch of officers arrived, converged on this shooting scene. Initially, they thought maybe that the shooting was over, but then they're hearing more rounds going off, and they're dealing with crowds rushing out of this establishment and rushing down the sidewalk. 3 officers that I represent moved to the threat. They didn't hesitate. They didn't seek cover. They're on a empty sidewalk with no cover, no concealment, and they ran towards the guy with the AR who was firing rounds and engaged him from 2 different directions. So absolute heroes, in my opinion. They did exactly what they are expected to do, put their duty ahead of their own personal safety. The district attorney here has a policy that every officer involved shooting, every critical incident will be reviewed by a grand jury. And we fully expected that he would continue that same practice. And there was some online chatter about, what are you talking about? How can this be? And why does this make sense? And of course, it didn't make sense. He felt heat from the media, and initially his plan was to do an expedited grand jury presentation, a very quick one. Get it in front of the grand jury, get them no billed. Um, but even that was, severely criticized, appropriately criticized. And so ultimately he buckled and issued a letter to the police chief saying that They had looked into it. Obviously, these guys are heroes, and therefore, no grand jury presentation will be needed. So, a significant departure from his normal operating procedure. And one of the good things about that is normally it takes about 9 or 10 months for an officer to have their case presented to a grand jury, and so during that time, they're on administrative duty, meaning they're not out on the street, they're not protecting and serving our community, and they're left twisting, wondering, "Am I gonna be indicted? Am I gonna have to go to trial? What's this gonna do to my family? How am I gonna pay for it?" And in many cases, that officer's married, and so there's a law enforcement spouse who's also experiencing the anxiety of the situation. It's horrific.
You're hitting on something that we see in cases, I mean, in all over the country where, these prosecutors take the approach that they are almost going to delegate their authority to the citizens and let the citizens just decide. So even in cases where obviously the case we're talking about now, it's in a sort of an extreme case of obvious justification. But there are lots and lots of cases that are pretty obviously justified that still have to go through that exact same process you're talking about. So, yes, it is great that in this instance, Mr. Garza is doing the right thing eventually. That's great. But how many other cases that aren't borderline cases, that are obvious, justified uses of deadly force that in accordance with their current with their actual written policy, they will wait for the grand jury. And as you said, they will wait 9 or 10 months. And in the meantime, the officer is sidelined, is questioning what's going to happen next. Am I going to be charged with a crime? Am I going to have to come up with a couple $100,000 to defend myself, even though I know I did the right thing? And so that leads to tremendous anxiety that goes through the whole community, right? The whole law enforcement community is in the same boat.
It's sad but true that we've represented enough officers that have experienced that ordeal that now when an officer comes in to meet with us following an officer-involved shooting, one of the things we do is put them in touch with older clients that have had to travel that journey. And, they get some peer support benefits from being able to talk to a guy who has faced all that
Mhm.
anxiety and dealt with it. So I wish I didn't have this collection of former clients that have undergone this stress. But on the other hand, I'm glad to be able to buddy up current clients with former clients that can help them navigate this journey.
We do that to some extent here at LELDF. Past people that we've supported, officers that we've supported that really want to help. That's kind of how they pay it forward is like, hey, everything worked out great for them. They learned a million lessons going through the process, and now they want to kind of pay it forward to other officers who are dealing with the same thing. So, still speaking about Garza's policy, you mentioned about the mandatory grand jury presentation, which he has decided to graciously waive in this very obvious case of hero law enforcement officers. But other officers who have done the right thing will still be ensnared in the same process. But other policies, especially regarding focusing on prosecuting law enforcement officers to the maximum extent possible while taking other offenders and trying to minimize to the extent possible what the charges are and even whether there will be charges, treating people who are not lawfully present in the United States more favorably than those who are lawfully present. I mean, all these policies, we call them progressive prosecution policies. These are adopted universally almost by the Soros-supported district attorneys, of which Mr. Garza is one.
At the bequest or direction of Wren Collective is my guess.
You saw exactly where I'm going. So Wren is actually based in Austin, so you may know more about them. I'm sure you know a lot more about them than your average listener, but we have done quite a bit of work, as you know, at LELDF at trying to expose the Wren Collective and show exactly the impact Wren is having on these offices around the country. But just, I know that you've done your own due diligence on Wren. Like, what would you say about an organization that actually dictates policies to district attorneys' offices across the country when there's either an explicit quid pro quo or maybe an implied quid pro quo that if you want to continue to receive our support, you will adopt these policies. Just as a practitioner for as long as you've been, what do you think about that type of arrangement?
Well, it strikes me as extremely anti-democratic because, I vote in district attorney elections and Wren has never been on the ballot. And so for them to control and have so much influence in our local district attorney's office is very problematic because they're unelected. They're unaccountable to anybody. And you and your team have done a great job of researching them, but we really don't know everything about them even still. Even after your extensive report, there's still a lot of questions. And I don't think it's appropriate for a district attorney to take policy direction from anybody, really. Their job is to apply the law as written by the legislature, not execute policies by some shadowy organization that we don't even know about, really.
Yeah, we don't know they operate more or less in secret, and the first that most people heard about the Wren Collective was when we put our report out showing, I mean, in great, great detail. It's on our website, by the way, policedefense.org. But you're right. There's a lot we don't know. And to me, one of the big factors is, A, yeah, we've got this organization who is feeding policies and encouraging, providing more or less ideological support to these offices, and how to adopt very, very far left policies. Most of these prosecutors have never been a line prosecutor before. Like you were a line prosecutor
Right.
and a special U.S. attorney and everything. So you have all that experience. But then to get elected DA, like Mr. Garza, I think he did an internship during law school at a prosecutor's office, and that's where he learned. What inspired him to go be a public defender. Like because he wanted to upend the whole system, which is what he's doing in Travis County. Um, you know, but to have or organization that's doing that is one thing, but it's even a step worse if it's also tied to campaign financing. So basically, you've got some level of implied or explicit quid pro quo. We'll give you money, you adopt this policy is kind of what it looks like.
And and if you buck the system that they've created, if you don't adhere to their policies, I believe what their their methodology is, they go out and find a further, progressive candidate further to the left of the current office holder and run that candidate against the person they previously supported. And so they know once they once they take the money and take the policy direction, they know if they want to remain in office, they have to continue. Otherwise, they're going to face a very well-financed opponent.
No question about it. And we've actually seen it happen, in other cities where if you don't toe the line, they bring somebody else in further left, give them the money,
Yeah,
and their chances of winning are very good. These elections, if you can raise, it depends on the city, but the amount of money it takes to win an election for district attorney is much lower than it would take to win, a U.S. Senate seat or even in a lot of places, even in a
right.
congressional seat. And so it's just a lot less money they have to spend to incorporate, to really bring these progressive policies in. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to try to at least touch on at least one of the cases involving law enforcement officers that you've represented in the past. I intentionally want to ask you about a case that has been fully adjudicated, and maybe you're more free to talk about it. But obviously, you might, you do still have limits on what you can and can't say. And I'd just like to, if I could have you tell the story of the case involving deputies Johnson and Camden, Williamson County deputies involved in a very dangerous pursuit with a guy who wound up dying that you tried, did a fantastic job, resulted in acquittal. There's a pursuit of a guy who's driving quite erratically, kind of running off the road in various places into Travis County, where finally the pursuit ends. I think it was because he finally crashed into something that he couldn't keep operating his car. They go to get him out and get him in handcuffs. This is all on video, by the way, so there's no speculation involved. They go to get him out. He's a larger guy, putting it mildly. I think he's a big guy. They are working on getting him in handcuffs. They're not striking him. There's no one piled on top of his back. And he just, during the attempt to get him in handcuffs, he just stops breathing. They call EMS right away. They start providing care. And even though there seemed to be an obvious absence of any sort of misconduct, Jose Garza still brought charges against these deputies.
Well, there's a couple important facts listeners have to understand about the case. So it was a 22-minute high-speed pursuit. that started in the county north of Austin. Austin's in Travis County. The county to the north is Williamson County. So two Williamson County deputies initially tried to pull the decedent over, and he fled and leads the deputies on a 22-minute high-speed pursuit. Very, very dangerous pursuit. Those officers happened to have a film crew with them from a reality TV show. I think it was called Live PD. They were doing a ride-along. And so not only do you have body cams, you have dash cams, but you have professional cameramen who filmed the entire incident. The decedent was 400 pounds, and I'm not exaggerating, 400 pounds with a documented extensive history of heart disease. And the pursuit, I believe, ended because he was having a heart attack. In other words, the stress of leading the cops on a 22-minute high-speed pursuit finally got to him, and he only stopped because he was in the midst of a heart attack. And at the end of the videotape, they also had a helicopter in the air. So you see from the helicopter angle that the car slowly starts slowing down and then hits a mailbox. And then the officers, knowing this guy had fled for 22 minutes, assumed correctly that he tried very hard to get away from them, and therefore he's dangerous, and therefore they need to do the appropriate things like get him into handcuffs. They didn't know he was having a heart attack. They just knew he was resisting arrest. As you said, they get him in handcuffs, but then immediately transition into life-saving measures, immediately call in EMS to come support, and he's transported and later dies at the hospital. Those two deputies were indicted, multiple counts on the indictment. We took the case to trial. They were acquitted. But an interesting fact that's not super well known, during that trial, we discovered that the district attorney's office failed to turn over exculpatory evidence to us. The decedent had a warrant out for his arrest, which very likely contributed to or was the reason why he was fleeing. They knew that, and they didn't turn it over to us, which is a violation of the court's discovery order, the Brady Doctrine, and a law here in Texas called the Michael Morton Act, which requires the district attorney to turn over all evidence. So they didn't do that. They hid this warrant, and we ultimately got the court to sanction the district attorney's office, which is unheard of. It never happens, but we got sanctions against them for failing to turn over this critical information.
Not to interrupt you, Doug, but that's also not the first time you've dealt with a serious breach of the prosecution's discovery obligations in a law enforcement officer case either. I know that.
Happy to report those guys were acquitted. It was a long road for them. And of course, they're very thankful for your support, financial support, making sure we had all the resources we needed to take that case to trial and win.
Yeah, that was a case that, like, most of our cases, it has a very happy ending for the officers, but the road is very tough. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think sometimes people underestimate how difficult it is to endure a criminal prosecution, especially for law enforcement officers, because these aren't people, they have never been charged with a crime before. They've never been through anything like this. And they don't have, cops don't make enough money to just start writing big checks to criminal defense lawyers in most cases. So some law enforcement officers are members of an association or a union or something that provides criminal defense, but across the country, most are not. So they don't have any insurance or other mechanism to pay for this. And that's why we get involved, because, we have the ability to raise the money needed as in this case, and then quite successfully through you and your team resulting in an acquittal. It's the classic LELDF case, but it's a great one to talk about, especially in the context of overreach prosecutors, which we see so much of nowadays. I really appreciate you making time to come on and share with our listeners your perspective, your experience, being a little bit in the middle of things in Travis County, Texas, where, as I said, you have a Soros prosecutor, as many cities do, but I really think that José Garza is really the main, as far as focusing so much on police cases and situations that should not be even considered for prosecution, that he is sort of the leading the way on that, so to speak. So, thank you so much for joining us, Doug. And I really appreciate the work that you do, you and your team. And I look forward to being able to work with you in the future, obviously, providing our LELDF resources where necessary in your cases.
Well, we value the relationship with your organization tremendously, and you make it easy to partner with. To me, from my perspective, it seems very streamlined and easy, which is good because we don't have time to deal with a lot of bureaucracy. We're going and going and going, and you guys step in when we need you. If you ever have an attorney out there that is on the fence about working with you, please have them call me because I'd be happy to tell them about our experience and how beneficial it's been.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the testimonials. We have such great donors who are law enforcement supporters. They get it. They support these guys and they have been so loyal to us and recognizing that the dollars that they send to us just get translated into dollars going to pay for these really significant expenses that are attorneys fees, expert witness fees, and the like. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us, Doug. It's been a great time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Holding the Line. We got great feedback on our episodes with Dennis Spalding, the officer from East Haven, Connecticut, who had a wild story about the injustice inflicted on him and his fellow cops there. You need to go back and listen to that if you haven't got a chance. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We're getting great feedback and we really appreciate it, but more the merrier. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.